Hey everyone, this is Luke with Serverless Guru. Today we're going to create a basic note-taking app taking advantage of AWS's GraphQL service called AppSync, and then we are going to deploy that using the serverless framework. This is going to be a multi-part video, and the first one is going to focus on the basic syntax of serverless and setup. So if you're already pretty comfortable with serverless, you can go ahead and skip to the next video where we dive in specifically to how AppSync applies. But if not, go ahead and follow along. It's also worth mentioning that this is going to be a more high-level video that is focusing on what things are getting placed as and how to read them, rather than looking into every single line item and determining what it is it's doing. Serverless can be pretty dense, so that would be a whole another set of videos on its own, but thankfully there are a lot of resources going into what these are accomplishing. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and leave comments on this video or look into them online. Before we get started, you're going to want to have your basic environment set up. For starters, you're obviously going to want to have an account set up. If you don't, go ahead and create it now. It's pretty quick. And then from there, you're going to want to install serverless on your machine. I'm going to install mine globally because I use it a fair amount. If you just want to store it locally, you can by replacing the G with an S after you've created your directory. And so once this is finished, we're going to also make sure that our AWS credentials are set up locally by doing AWS configure. You can see here that my access key ID, secret access key, and region are all already set up. If you do not have this, you'll want to create an IAM user and get that information to populate this field. Then once all of this is out of the way, we are good to go to create a directory. I'm going to go ahead and move to the desktop and create a new directory called serverless backend, serverless AppSync back. And then I'm going to go ahead and change into that directory. From there, we're going to want to go ahead and create a new template. SLS is a shortened way of referencing to serverless. I'm going to create a template in the AWS Node.js, and I'm going to name it the same as our basic file. And with all of that, we should be good to go. You can see there that it's ready. I'm also going to initialize npm before I get into it. And from there, I'm just going to open it up. You'll see that we really don't have a lot of files to start with. We have gitignore and your package.json, which should be pretty familiar. We have our serverless YAML file, which has a lot of notes that may be helpful if you're new, but for this sake, I'm just going to delete them for clarity. Not yet. And then lastly, we have our handler file. This is a function that's going to get used with our lambdas. In this particular tutorial video, we are not going to be taking advantage of them. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this and also get rid of the function here. So not a whole lot left up at this place, so there's a lot that we need to build out on our own. The first would be to get any dependencies we need set up. I'm going to go ahead and use this completed file as a reference through the course of this video. We're going to drop all of these at the end underneath our licenses. These are just some basic serverless plugins I find helpful for the YAML. We can go into those in a little detail. We also have AWS SDK and serverless being brought in here. And when we move to our serverless YAML file, we can bring in those three specific serverless files as plugin right between service and provider. And just a quick touch on what these are all accomplishing. Service is the name of our basic overall app. As you can see, the service in reference here is going to be our stack of files that is all getting deployed and created in unison. these plugins are all referencing our serverless related plugins, not, you'll notice, our AWS or serverless general files. And then our provider is just our name of AWS and our runtime of Node.js 10. I'm going to switch it back to 8.10 because this is what my current setup is running in, and why break a good thing? From there, we can go ahead and add some more additional provider information. Profile is going to be the credentials that are used to reference this. I think it's worth quick looking into the console to see what that's doing. If you look at your Vim file, or if you run Vim on your AWS credentials, then you can see all your different profiles in action. I'm going to shove this all the way to the edge so that you can't see all of my access codes. But you can see when I run that I have multiple different profiles on my computer that can get run in different instances. I have default, I have Serverless Guru, and the keys are all available there. And so you can go ahead and edit them as needed. In this case, default is what's going to be accessed. But if I needed to, say, use my company's Serverless Guru one, then I could go ahead and do that now. And I have my region set, I have timeout set, and lastly, a stage. This is completely optional and just something that Serverless Guru does for the sake of creating multiple versions. To dig into it just a little bit, we're saying that every single set of resources we have is either going to be named, say, test, production, development, and that we were able to keep those different files separate and immediately create them. That's part of the beauty of serverless, is that you can just rerun all of these, and by simply passing in a new variable, like say dev, I can completely build the stack all over again using a different variable. But again, if I don't use it, it'll just default to test, which is great. Now, a next little side note here is that some of our other resources can be brought in from other areas. This is, again, more optional, but these are just some different ways to think about how they are all being used in unison, and also just, you know, a good best practice that I think is meaningful. So I'm going to go ahead and add to this config folder 2 files that I already have, or one I should say. This config test JSON just has a couple variables that are going to be useful all the way through this app creation. We have our default timeout of 120. We have my account console, which if you look at all of your AWS stuff is just simply going to be this number here you log in with. I have the name of my DynamoDB table that I want to be created, and then my S3 bucket that I want to be created. Now, these things are good to look at to see what they're accomplishing. This looks a little confusing at first, but actually becomes very useful. Here we are naming our S3 bucket based on self-service and self-provider.stage. If we go back and look in that, we can see what the name is going to be created. Self.service on the serverless file is just going to be this name of our file. Since there's no additional attributes, it just defaults to that. And then again, when we look at self-provider.stage, we can see that the self file provider.stage is either going to be our default of test or the value that we pass in when we finally deploy the app, which could be like, say, dev or prod. And so this is going to be our SLS AppSync backend file hyphen dev prod whatever hyphen bucket. And we're going to be able to change that regularly. And then this is referencing a variable, a custom variable that we have not created yet. And in this case, I'm going to want it to be based on the actual name of our file being used. If I go ahead and create a custom section, I can just say that there is a thing called base that is simply going to be that exact setup that we just showed. So rather than calling this every time, I can simply call custom base, which we've defined in this file to mean exactly this. So again, not necessary, but just makes things a little helpful. As we continue down with additional custom variables, like say an account, which is going to reference the specific config file at this account and get us that information, or we can access our specific DynamoDB table over here and just sort of get all of these available for us for future references down the road. And then from there, we are going to go ahead and add some additional resources. This is a setup that you're going to see relatively frequently. Looking through all these different processes, this file can get incredibly long, and it's not necessary to separate a lot of these resources, but it does just make things easier to keep track of, and modular, which is always a great way to go. Go ahead and finding my different folders over here. And there we go. Again, I'm just going to run through these pretty quickly. Our Cognito is creating just a bunch of different resources like user pool, identity pool, Cognito unauthorized role, and so forth that we'll be able to use for user login. This is not actually stuff that I plan on using for these tutorial videos, but they're just so ubiquitous and important that I figured I would leave these in here for your review. And that could also be an important and useful challenge if you wanted to try adding something on, was to try to add authorization to users. For example, rather than having a shared notes table like this is going to be, have individual users who need to log in. You can see that we're just referencing different resources, using these same different references to names we've already created. And so again, all of these different resources are going to be dynamically named as well, so we can continue to create different versions of them whenever we choose to reuse them. We have our Cognito outputs, which is just going to give us names that we can reference. We have our DynamoDB table, which is going to create us a table with just some basic attributes that are pretty safe to use over and over again. And then finally, we are going to finish out our serverless YAML file by adding some more user variables. And these are just going to be referencing some of our resources over here in order to create these. And from there, we should be pretty well set up already. I know this is a lot of fast copy pasting, and a lot of it may look a bit opaque for now, but as you continue to use it more and more, they do become easier to work with and very useful. I'm going to go ahead and install all of this now, and in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and additionally create a scripts folder. This is yet another optional part, but as your scripts get more complicated, it just makes a little more sense to have them spelled out for you. In this case, we remember that we have our stage, which takes potentially multiple variables. Like say it's going to default to test, but if we pass something, it's going to be different. So we're going to be looking for that variable. We're either going to use it or default to test. And then this is going to alert us in the console what's happening or which stage we're deploying it to. I'm going to get debug tools going. I'm going to deploy some additional stacks and then deploy our main stack. Now it's worth mentioning that these additional stacks are one of the plugins that we added here. What that's really doing is just allowing us to create our Cognito and DynamoDB resources separately before we do our main deployment. And the real benefit there is just that if anything goes wrong here, we're going to have a bunch of resources that are half finished and stopped, and there can be some ugly mess up or cleanup involved if there's a lot of stuff all getting deployed that isn't cleanly separated. Here, it's more like if we have our Cognito finished, our DynamoDB finished, and then the main app has some new issues that get introduced, we can know for sure that these resources are going to be unimpacted because they're kind of going to be skipped every time because they're already created. So now we can see that we have our new script set up. Our npm install has finished cleanly. I'm going to lastly add in a script to use this new script. A deploy that is referencing the location in that scripts folder. And from there, we should be able to just see all of this go offline. The way you're going to be watching this, and I'll go ahead and keep this open on the side, is through CloudFormation. Now, a lot of what serverless is accomplishing is really just working in CloudFormation. It's just a lot of added syntax and utility that just makes it easier to work with in some instances. I find that this text becomes pretty helpful as you move along, and they tend to be shorter code lists than you find on the general CloudFormation ones. So here you can already see that we are creating our AppSync backend file test Cognito, which is our first additional stack, just like we asked it to deploy before. And so this is just showing us, all the different things it's creating: a user pool client, identity pool, authorized role, and it's showing us when the creation starts, at what time, when it's completed, and so forth. And as long as everything goes smoothly, it's just going to progress through the next two as well. So while these are going, I figure it's a good time to explain sort of a little bit more of the why you would even want to bother with all of this. You may have been wondering or thinking that nothing that has really been accomplished here is that revolutionary. If you've worked with AWS before, you've created your own S3 buckets, you've created your own DynamoDB tables, you've created your own user pools. So, this was a lot of effort to kind of do the same thing. Where it kind of becomes useful is two main ways I've found. A big one is obviously just repetition becomes much quicker. You've created this a bunch of times, since you're just going to have to keep creating tables and setting up rules, fixing the backend, and so forth. And at a certain point, especially if you're making a lot of websites, that becomes a little bit of a waste of time. And so by setting this up here, you can just keep redeploying the exact same setup, just with a different name and on new projects. And so rather than having to keep creating all of these and remembering the exact connections between your DynamoDB, your Cognito, all your other resources, you can just have all of them managed over here. Especially as it balloons into a larger project with more services, remembering all those connections can be a big pain. Additionally, it makes redeployment a lot easier. You can see here that now these have completed. We have all three files done. And that's great, but if I make any additions and wanted to change it, it could be hard to redeploy those and fix them. In this case, I can go ahead and run the exact same thing and have an additional setup. Actually, before I do that, it's really close to breaking there. I did actually want to add two files. Bear with me a moment. The dynamic testing, sometimes you are hard coding the specific reference. And so in this instance, we have our test, but I want to create a new alpha branch because I feel good about this and want to go to an alpha production. And so now when they're looking for this config file, they'll have that available. So if I run and deploy alpha, we are now going to run through all this exact same stuff, but it's deploying to alpha. And so as you're looking around, we have our DynamoDB. This was all I had in here previously. Boom, here's our SLS AppSync backend file test notes. If we look at our user pools, we can see that these are getting updated as well. And in fact, you can see the brand new one here too. You can see I created my test one, but where is it? Yeah, I have the test one, and now I also have the alpha. And so just like that, I'm immediately creating all of these different resources over again. And every time I want to deploy it, it'll already be ready and available to redeploy. So yeah, just in big summary, just by setting up this file, we were able to create user pools, identity pools, DynamoDB tables, an S3 bucket, and we're able to watch all of that happen in real time in our cloud formation. And we are now able to continue editing that and just redeploy it. It's a really fast turnaround. And so, yeah, that's the first part of the video. I hope you found it all very useful. On the next one, we are going to go ahead and edit all of this to include AppSync dependencies and setups. That way you'll be able to access your DynamoDB table by mutating it and querying it using AWS AppSync. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and hope to hear from you. Thank you again. Again, this is Luke with Serverless Guru.